Hello, my name is Stephen Payson, and I am delivering a presentation that I developed entitled Literature-Only Economic Theory, Its Illegitimacy and the Harm that it Causes. This presentation may be freely used for educational and training purposes with the accreditation that is shown in this slide. For substantial discounts, such as 50% on the book, or for other presentations based on the book, see the YouTube channel, How Economics Professors Can Stop Failing Us, at the website shown on the last line of the slide. By the end of April 2018, portions of this presentation will be delivered at as many as 18 organizations and forums, at 4 annual conferences of economics associations, at the meetings of 2 economic societies, at 2 government offices, at 5 talk shows, 2 radio shows, and 3 video recorded and broadcast shows, and at 6 universities to both student groups and economics faculty in the United States and Great Britain. The organizations and forums are listed here, and many more are planned for after April 2018. Before I begin, I would like to express both a disclaimer and a clarifying remark. The disclaimer is that this presentation and the book itself reflect my own views, which do not necessarily reflect the opinions of any organization to which I belong. I would like to clarify that my book does not mean to say that all economics professors are failing us. In fact, I make a point to talk about economics professors who I believe are excellent role models for the profession, who have never and could never fail us. As an example of the fact that I am not accusing all economics professors of failing us, I devote the book to the memory of my dissertation advisor, Kelvin Lancaster, who in my mind could never fail us. In the book, I identify a wide variety of problems that exist in the academic economics profession, but for the purposes of this presentation, it might be useful for us to focus here on 2 of the main problems, which seem to contribute one way or another to all of the other problems. These are: many economics professors look upon their profession as an intellectual game of amusement and base their work primarily on what could be called mental self-gratification. And 2, as Ethel Merman said it best, there is no business like show business. That is, there is often a big difference between the show business of the publication game that economics professors play and honest efforts to contribute to a better understanding of economics. We will come back to these problems quite a bit throughout this presentation. Finally, before I really get started, I would like to explain that there is yet another very important qualifier which I need to make for economics students as opposed to any others who might be hearing this presentation. I would like economics students to understand that this presentation is not about the economics you are studying now. What I mean is that the kind of economics you need to study in undergraduate courses is like going down a nicely paved road like the one on the left. The textbooks and lectures explain the basics that make economics economics. Personally, I think it's pretty good stuff, which is why I became an economist myself. However, this particular road seems to be leading to Death Valley, so you do need to be careful where you are going. For those of you who do decide to go to graduate school, the road is more like the one on the top right. The path is still clear, but it's much rougher going. And finally, if you decide to become an economics professor who is trying to advance in your career by publishing journal articles, then you really don't have a road anymore. And you're struggling just to keep moving without getting stuck in the mud. So by this analogy, some professors are stuck in the mud, and stuck in stuff that is perhaps worse than mud. And so I see my book as my way of offering them a way forward. Now, the book is about 350 pages long, and so I could not possibly cover all of it in one presentation. I will focus this particular talk on one of the central themes of the book, which involves a concept that I have termed literature-only economic theory. Literature-only economic theory does not represent all of economic theory. Some economic theory is literature-only and some is not. I define it in terms of 3 criteria. It must meet every one of these criteria, otherwise it is not literature-only economic theory. Number 1, it relies on strong arbitrary assumptions, and if the assumptions were replaced by other equally defensible alternative assumptions, then its findings would be completely different. 2, it goes so deep into highly mathematical constructs that it is generally incomprehensible to everyone, including other advanced economists who are adept in mathematics. It is comprehensible only to the few people in the world who happen to be thoroughly familiar with its particular thread of mathematical modeling, or those who are not familiar with that thread, but who would be willing to spend days to study it, and very few people would do that. And 3, literature-only economic theory will never see the light of day in any textbook or classroom lecture, and will never be put to any practical use. So if you do see it in a textbook or a lecture, then it does not meet this criterion, and therefore it is not literature-only economic theory. In short, literature-only economic theory serves only one purpose, which is to be published in a technical journal and to be accepted for publication on the basis of its impressiveness to the journal's editor and reviewers. At the top of the slide, I have a very small sample of what literature-only economic theory looks like. It is created from the development of a very specific, highly sophisticated model. It pretends to be discovering something real, but in reality it is simply studying the mathematical properties of whatever it created in the first place. We will come back to this in a minute. As shown in the pyramid, I have identified 3 categories of the research and writing that academic economists perform. Number 1, applied economic analysis and economic statistical findings. 2, useful economic theory for application or better understanding. And again, literature-only economic theory. Of course, useful economic theory is what economics professors are supposed to work on. The trouble is that useful economic theory is often too hard to come by and often too unimpressive to be accepted in the top-ranked journals. So the lion's share of the work that the most prominent economics professors perform and what is expected of them to achieve their prominence is contributions to literature-only economic theory. It is what the top journals want, and publications in top journals is what academic economics departments want of their faculty. It is and has long been the limelight of the economics profession and the road to stardom for prominent economics professors. Now let us put this all aside for the moment and consider the distinction between 2 things: the scientific pursuit of useful knowledge versus competition in an intellectual game of amusement. There is surely a clear difference between the 2. The first involves a commitment to make the world a better place and to honestly understand causality, where such a greater understanding is an end in itself, regardless of whether such knowledge can be directly applied. The second is about having fun and taking pride in being able to win the game. Of course, as I show here, both are also motivated by fortune and fame. For many people in the economics profession and for many economic students, it is obvious that the generation of literature-only economic theory is a legitimate science and not merely an intellectual game of amusement. In fact, I would say that it is as obvious to them as the difference in colors between the 2 middle squares in the Rubik's Cube in the next slide. We can see with our own eyes, if we are not colorblind, that the top middle square is dark brown, while the middle square in the front side is light orange. These colors are completely different in the same way that literature-only economic theory as a legitimate science is completely different from any intellectual game of amusement like chess. But bear with me for a moment. I want to take a deeper look at this Rubik's Cube. I am going to start blocking off parts of it without changing any of the colors in any of the squares. All I am doing is blocking them out as I go. And as I do this, you can stare at the two middle cubes to be totally confident that I did not change their colors. We have just witnessed a fantastic optical illusion. The colors we see, or the colors we may think we see, depend enormously on the colors of whatever surrounds them. Squares number 1 and number 2 are essentially the same color, but because of their environment, one looks dark brown and the other light orange. The same illusion takes place in the view that many people, especially many academic economists, have of literature-only economic theory. When we deeply examine precisely what literature-only economic theory is and how it is produced and compare it to an intellectual game of amusement, we will indeed see no difference between them. But why, then, does literature-only economic theory appear to the casual observer to be a legitimate science? Because it is surrounded by things that make it look like a legitimate science, such as its esoteric mathematical models, the research grants that it receives from science and research foundations, the fact that university economics departments stand by it, and that technical journals in economics publish it. Likewise, we see that leadership positions in our society are often offered to the champions of this intellectual game, with media coverage of what those champions of the game have to say about economics. And we see those champions surrounded by naive believers who are simply too impressed with the mathematics in their theories to question the scientific legitimacy of those theories. I will now present what I believe provides a great example of literature-only economic theory, and it also demonstrates, in my view, the two core problems with the academic economics profession that I have just identified. Number one, the preoccupation with mental self-gratification, and two, a focus on playing the game of getting published instead of making a valuable contribution to understanding economic phenomena. First of all, what is this article? This article is published in the most prestigious, highest-ranking economics journal in the United States, American Economic Review, which is published by the largest and by far most influential economic organization in the United States, the American Economic Association. The article is current, published in February 2018. But it is not just any AER article. This article is one that the American Economic Association has been advertising as one of its best and brightest. What do I mean by that? Well, if you wanted to get a copy of an AER article, you usually have to pay for it, or be a member of the AEA, or be in an institution that has access to the journal. This article, however, was being showcased on the AEA main website under leading news and offered to the public for free. In other words, the AEA is so proud of this article that they are showing it off and giving it out for free. Now, what is this article about? Well, does it address any important economic question? Does it offer any help in preventing future financial crises? Does it offer any hope that people will still be able to find employment after robots replace many of the existing jobs? Does it have any suggestions for how developing countries could grow their economies and improve their living standards? No. In fact, it has nothing to do with economics. What's this again? Here is an article written by economics professors at a high-ranking university, published in the most prestigious economic journal in the United States, and being showcased as a great work by the largest and most influential organization of economists in the United States, and yet it has nothing to do with economics. This article is about the order in which co-authors' names are listed when a journal article is published. You see, when co-authors are equal in importance in terms of their contribution to writing an article, their names tend to be listed in alphabetical order. But when they are not equal in importance to the article, then whoever the most important author is, they are listed first. And this creates an advantage for people whose names tend to be first in alphabetical order, because they could be confused as being the most important author when they are not. And likewise, it creates a disadvantage for people whose names start with letters that are toward the end of the alphabet. So this article is about how we can flip a coin, literally, to let people know that the co-authors' names are in random order, unless we really want to say that someone is the first author by being the greatest contributor. Okay, perhaps this is a good idea, but is it worthy of a journal article in the nation's most prestigious economics journal, which only accepts a very tiny fraction, like 1 or 2%, of all the papers submitted to it for possible publication? Well, the economics professors who manage the journal would say, of course it should be published. And their real reason for this is obvious, though they would definitely use very different words for explaining that reason than the words that I'm about to use now. The reason that this is published in the AR is because of the fantastic degree of highly mathematical, esoteric, incomprehensible, mental self-gratification that we can see in the article. This mental self-gratification begins on page 494 of the article and keeps on going all the way to page 519. That's 25 pages of hardcore mental self-gratification based on arbitrary assumptions that allow us to prove impressive theorems based on those assumptions. Now, why do I think that all of these assumptions are arbitrary? Well, because I took 5 minutes to think about it logically, which any reasonably deductive person walking down the street could do as well. In particular, the authors analyzed to the nth degree the advantage that people named Abernathy have over people named Zuckerberg in being sometimes mistakenly thought to be the primary author when they were only equal contributors to the article. The authors neglected all flip sides of this issue, however. For example, if Zuckerberg was, in fact, the less important author, some people will give Zuckerberg more credit than he or she deserves, assuming that the only reason Zuckerberg is listed second is because of alphabetical order. Thus, in reality, it is totally ambiguous as to whether alphabetization is more beneficial to Abernathy or to Zuckerberg. This simple logic was missed by this article because the article arbitrarily assumed the advantage was to Abernathy and then produced 26 pages of mathematical esoterica and minutiae to simply dance around the idea as a purely intellectual exercise. In other words, these 26 pages may be seen as answering the proverbial academic question of how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. Both are indeed difficult analytical problems that rely entirely on arbitrary assumptions. And indeed, to mix metaphors, the authors of this article have won their chess tournament in having their work published in the AER, a credential that is actually worth a lot more to them than any trophy they could have won for first place in a chess tournament. As part of their winnings, the authors also proudly mention in a footnote in the article that their work was supported by 2 grants from a prestigious research foundation. So this work actually earned some money for their institutions, for which they will also be rewarded. As already mentioned, this article is not about economics. It is about the publication game in economics. This is not by accident. This is what many economics professors, often in the most prestigious positions, see themselves as doing. They see their job as working to be successful at playing the game of getting published in economics journals. This is why they think economics professors like them exist. Let us also bear in mind that this same issue of whether life is unfair for co-authors named Zuckerberg applies to published literature in every other field of science and social science. So why isn't there an article like this in a medical journal, or a physics journal, or a psychology journal? Perhaps it is simply because medical school professors, physics professors, and psychology professors could not care less, to use the softest words possible, about an issue like this, because perhaps they are more interested in advancing knowledge in the fields of medicine, physics, and psychology. For nearly 40 years, I have known a very famous joke about economic theory that I have heard at least a dozen times. It is about the economist who is looking on the ground for keys that she has lost. A passerby asks her what she is doing, and she says, "I am looking for my lost car keys and heard them fall out of my pocket while I was walking through the dark alley about a block from here." The passerby then asks, "Wait a minute, if you lost your keys in the alley, why are you looking for them here under the lamppost?" And she answers, "Because the light is better here." The idea of the joke is that economic theory is the light that enables us to see and in some way make progress in understanding things, even if it is somewhat removed from reality. In reality, however, the exact opposite is what has happened to the profession. In most cases, the real light is simple, logical, observable truth. In these cases, the key did not fall in a dark alley. It fell right under the lamppost and can easily be seen and picked up. But economists working on literature-only economic theory do not want to look for the keys under the lamppost, even when they know the keys are there. They want to look for them in the dark alley instead. Many have no genuine interest in finding the keys. Their interest is to show off how they can proceed through the dark alley to demonstrate how clever they are in making assumptions to compensate for the darkness, and then pretending to discover something from the exercise. Using simple observable truth will only give you the right answers, but would not be mathematically impressive enough for the journals to publish your work. Here is another simple example, which happens to be only part of certain literature-only economic theory, on the phenomenon of human drug addiction, supposedly explaining the consumer behavior of drug addicts. One of the many absurdities of this optimal control problem, as shown here, is that there is absolutely nothing in it that pertains specifically to drug addiction. The same equations could be used to explain how much toilet paper a person chooses to buy. The model also implicitly assumes, in effect, that drug addicts are more adept at solving advanced mathematical optimization problems than most professional mathematicians. This begs the absurd question of why these drug addicts are assumed to have so little income when they could simply work as well-paid mathematics professors given their assumed abilities. Contrast this to what neuroscientists do to understand the behavior of drug addicts. Without going into any details about this figure, we can automatically see that the perspective is completely different. This is because neuroscience research, like any legitimate science, is focused on understanding causality as it occurs in the real world. It is not focused on impressing readers and peer reviewers with esoteric mathematics. Let us now clarify again that what I am saying here is not a criticism of economic theory itself. Economic theory like the Slutsky equation or the Heckscher-Ohlin model or the Lancaster-Lipsey theory of the second best, etc., are exactly what makes economics economics. The problem is not with abstraction. The problem is with relevance. Economic theory must be relevant to understanding the real world or having real-world applications. Some pluralist economists have often expressed similar concerns about the profession. Many may ask if this set of criticisms is a pluralist set of criticisms. The answer is no. However, this discussion is highly relevant to pluralism in the sense that it has bearing on how receptive the academic economics community is toward pluralism. That is, I would argue that this discussion explains in part why pluralism is not given greater attention in economic discourse. Most pluralists seem to believe that the only reason that mainstream neoclassical economists do not adopt more pluralist approaches is because those neoclassical economists do not realize that pluralism offers them a better understanding of the world. So many pluralist economists, in my view, delude themselves into thinking that if they could only convince neoclassical economists that pluralist theories explain the world better, then pluralism would win them over. I call this delusional because in most cases the problem is not that neoclassical economists truly believe that neoclassical economics explains the world better or have even thought much about it. The problem is that neoclassical economists in many cases are simply motivated and incentivized by the game of promoting the kind of models that will advance them in their careers. And those career-promoting models are neoclassical models, not pluralist models. Now wait a minute. All this harsh criticism of literature-only economic theory sounds totally nuts, doesn't it? Does anyone else agree with any of this? Well, as it happens, there are some other nutcases like me who have been vocal about the same issue, especially after the Great Recession hit in 2008. Here is one of them, a guy named Joe Stiglitz, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics, chaired the President's Council of Economic Advisors, etc. He wrote in the Financial Times, "It is hard to understand how peculiar the predominant macroeconomic models were. Many assumed demand had to equal supply, and that meant no unemployment. Right now, a lot of people are just enjoying an extra dose of leisure." I believe Professor Stiglitz was being somewhat sarcastic in that last comment. Here is another one, Paul Krugman, who said in an article in the New York Times that the central cause of the profession's failure was the desire for an intellectually elegant approach to show off mathematical prowess. This romanticized vision led most to ignore all the things that can go wrong. While we're at it, here's another one, some guy named Robert Solow. When Congress was investigating the academic economics profession right after the Great Recession, essentially asking, how could you guys let this happen to us? They asked this guy, Bob, to testify. And what did Bob say? Well, he said in so many words in his testimony before Congress, Hey, those models that academic economists believed in, well, they stink. They're phony. And then there's this guy, Ulysses Leontiev, who happened to have been Robert Solow's dissertation advisor. He was a Nobel laureate in economics in 1973 and the founder of input-output analysis. And when Leontiev was the president of the American Economic Association back in 1970, he described literature-only economic theory at that time in his presidential address before the AEA members. He described this literature as being scandalous and reflecting an unsatisfactory and slightly dishonest state of affairs. I will now stop at these four Nobel laureates and rest my case that I am simply not alone in my criticisms of literature-only economic theory. But if the profession already realizes that literature-only economic theory is only a game, motivated primarily by self-amusement and the need to publish, then why has the profession allowed it to continue? Well, there are several reasons. First of all, there is a misunderstanding over what makes certain forms of knowledge more valuable than other forms of knowledge. Our impressive, hard to understand equations that are proven to be correctly derived on the basis of their mathematical properties, but which have no connection to reality, valuable forms of knowledge. Scientists know the answer to this, and that answer is a resounding no. All scientists and economists alike have a very important job to do, and that is to understand reality, not to impress one another with their prowess in mathematics, as Krugman put it. In addition, there is a Darwinistic survival within the profession of those who lack a strong interest in the pursuit of useful knowledge, but who enjoy the mathematical game playing. Similarly, we have a Darwinistic survival of the individuals who are naive admirers of the profession's most prominent leaders. And another reason it exists is that the profession is indoctrinated into thinking that only extremely complex ideas are worthy of interest and attention, as if we must pretend that we are all so smart that we already know all things that are easy to understand. So anything that is as easy to understand as the worthlessness of literature-only economic theory is too simple to be worthy of any thought or discussion among most economics professors. Nevertheless, many of the criticisms of literature-only economic theory have been made in the most sophisticated manner through thousands of pages of highly philosophical, highly scholarly, and often rather esoteric historical literature. Yet, in my view, we can get the strongest understanding of the problem by the wisdom displayed in one of the greatest children's fables ever written. I am referring to the extremely cliché fable by Hans Christian Andersen entitled The Emperor's New Clothes. But I am not referring here to the cliché metaphor about an emperor walking naked while everyone is quiet about it because they have deluded themselves, as the emperor has deluded himself, into thinking that he is actually wearing beautiful clothes. As many of us know, at the end of the story, a small child shouts out in the crowd, "But he has no clothes," and then people believe the child because of his or her innocence. That is the cliché main plot of the story. But there is something much richer and indeed brilliant and timeless about Andersen's story. Even though it was written 180 years ago, it is as applicable today as it ever was. The gem of the fable was the premise that was laid out by the swindlers who came into the town to pretend to sell clothes to the emperor. The premise was that if someone cannot see the clothes, it would only be because they were feeble-minded and thus not fit for the office they hold. In this story, The emperor therefore assigns his most trusted minister to inspect the clothes, and the minister comes back saying that the clothes are beautiful. This is because the minister was terrified that if he dares says that he cannot see the clothes, he will be seen as unfit for his position. This is precisely one of the greatest problems that faces the academic economics profession today. Those who say that they see nothing of value in the literature-only economic theory are simply afraid to say it because they think that they will be seen as being unfit for their positions. Remember, even though many economics professors do not work on literature-only economic theory, it is still widely believed that literature-only economic theory is at the top of the pyramid or career food chain, that it is the gold standard for economic thinking in many people's minds, and the source of stardom for the profession's most prominent and most highly acclaimed members. The problem is pervasive. I ran into it big time in the late 1980s when I worked on my dissertation about technological change. At that time, there was a fad in the profession, in the form of literature-only economic theory, about general-purpose technologies that offered absolutely no useful understanding of the process of technological change. The fad was promoted by famous academic theoreticians as if their theories were brilliant discoveries only because of the heavy lifting of mathematics that they used. So let us now ask, how far has the profession's leadership actually gone to address the problem? Unfortunately, not far at all. I will now give an example from my own experience in communicating with leaders of the profession. In 2006, I had started a nonprofit organization called the Association for Integrity and Responsible Leadership in Economics and Associated Professions, or AIRLEAP for short. In 2008, I was writing to various professors I knew to seek their endorsement of the organization, and in some cases to see if they might be interested in serving on our board of directors. The effort was actually fairly successful. For instance, we received a nice endorsement from David Colander at that time, and another very nice one from Deirdre McCloskey, who soon after that became the chair of our board of directors. At that time, I also wrote to Robert Solow, who I knew from when I had worked many years earlier at the National Science Foundation while he was there as a member of the National Science Board. We exchanged a couple letters back and forth. Bob Solow always refused to use email. Here is a copy of one of the letters in which he basically supports the opposition, the same opposition that I have expressed, to what he called, in his own words, excessive abstraction, high theory with no apparent tie to any pressing problem, and so on. But what did Bob Solow say we should do about this problem? Well, one thing he said we should not do, or at least he would not support it if we did, is to have any, quote, organized campaign to redirect what bright young economists do, unquote. He said, quote, the resistance should resist by example in writing and teaching. The sessions of the AEA and regional conventions are exactly the right sort of thing. Perhaps a good idea would be sessions in which approaches to a particular question are both exemplified, each by their own protagonist, rather than a general debate. In short, leaders like Robert Solow have called for polite discussions of alternative perspectives, not even a debate on the issue. In my view and from my experience, I know that these polite discussions are surely destined to be inconsequential, with each side politely agreeing to disagree in the end. So let us now ask, what has the profession's leadership done for generations to prevent literature-only economic theory from crowding out useful and valuable economic theory in economics? First of all, I would argue that they have done less than nothing. That is, the leadership of the academic economics profession has done more to contribute to the problem than to correct it. But wait a minute, isn't it true that many of these leaders have contributed by complaining about the problem in blogs, op-eds, and occasional articles? Yes, they have. I have shown some of them to you, in fact, earlier in this presentation when I quoted from 4 Nobel laureates. And yet, these have done nothing, and the leaders themselves realize this. But why do such blogs and op-eds have no effect? Well, first of all, they simply preach to the choir, to those who already recognize the problem. So these blogs make their leaders feel proud to be supposedly trying to improve the situation, while at the same time knowing their influence would be minuscule at best. By the start of the next day, they can say, I wrote my blog, but I can't make people read it or react to it. So I did what I could, and today is a new day, so now I will write about something else. What these leaders have not done, for the most part, is to consider economics. The fact that it is the incentive system within the economics profession that creates and maintains the problem. In particular, instead of making futile, altruistic appeals for a greater interest in reality, the profession's leadership should realize one of the most basic principles of economics itself. Borrowing from Adam Smith, it is not from the benevolence of economics professors that we expect our useful theories, but from their regard to their own interest. That is, the profession's leaders must understand that it is the incentive system that needs to be changed, and only they have the power and authority to change it. Along similar lines, there is the need to look critically and honestly at the true value of the profession's cherished publications. The entire profession, but especially its leaders, need to seriously address the true value of the literature-only theoretical economics that is lucky enough, through the right connections in most cases, to get published in the top-ranked journals. This is the prize that drives the whole system, but is that prize truly valuable? As already suggested, it is not. To do this kind of analysis, the leaders of the profession need to redefine who the heroes of the profession truly are. Those heroes are not necessarily those who have the most publication counts in top-ranked journals or the most citation counts, but those who have contributed the best ideas. This means the profession has to now read and understand the literature again, instead of just counting it in terms of the numbers of publications and citations, which the profession has learned to do all too well in the past generations. Furthermore, the profession needs to redefine loyalty. For example, I am certain that there are many people in the profession who would consider this presentation itself to be disloyal to the economics profession. When I have given this presentation before audiences, I have often seen many people nodding their heads after I said that some people in the profession would consider this presentation itself to be disloyal to the economics profession. This is a very big and troubling problem at many levels. Leaders of the academic economics profession generally see their positions as serving the interests of their academic departments or their universities, and so they see themselves as spokespersons to defend how the profession is run, regardless of how well it is run. As spokespersons, they are essentially politicians who may feel that it is their responsibility to describe their department's work with the most favorable spin possible, for better public relations, for receiving more research grants to support the department's work, etc. In my view, loyalty in the context of promoting good public relations for your own institution is fine, ceteris paribus. If, however, such loyalty involves a public deception, falsely claiming that certain theoretical literature has much more value than it actually has, then this is a form of ultimate disloyalty to the profession and ultimate disloyalty to the public. Conversely, exposing the problems that need to be fixed, even if it means criticizing your own department or your own departmental colleagues, is a form of loyalty to the profession and to society. It is analogous to how a good cop in a police department would act when finding out there are corrupt cops in the same department. If the good cop turns a blind eye to it, simply to protect their peers, that may be loyalty to them, but disloyalty to the public, and in fact it makes them co-conspirators. The same principle should apply to academic economists in their publicly expressed positive assessment of literature-only economic theory. Indeed, the profession needs to capture the ethical high ground by placing loyalty to the public and loyalty to truthful economic science above any loyalty in the context of public relations to their own individual institutions or to their peers or cronies in their particular subfield. Yet, in spite of all these arguments, many will be inclined to ask the simple question, "Geez Louise, what is the big deal?" In particular, many might ask, what's the big deal if a bunch of the most prominent economics professors, dink around all day long, gratifying themselves by looking at their beautiful models instead of doing valuable work? Their classes are still being taught, so why not let them have their fun? Isn't that what being a professor is all about? And they might further ask, and besides, who needs them anyway? They may simply assume that serious economics, the economics that will make a difference for society, will still be handled by other economics professors who are interested in making a valuable contribution, and by the other economists in business, government, and NGOs. In addition, many others might say, all this talk about a lot of theoretical economic literature being valueless doesn't make any sense. That literature is peer-reviewed and selected prior to publication, so its quality is assured, isn't it? And the number of citations it receives further corroborates its legitimacy, doesn't it? Now, let us address these questions. First of all, many economics professors are not having so much fun as if this were a legitimate excuse to begin with. Academic economists at the start of their careers are in a very high-pressured environment where they are often compelled to produce literature that they themselves do not believe in, simply in order to keep their job security. Many of them would greatly wish to be in a different environment where useful knowledge is given a higher value. Secondly, the idea of academic economics being separate from other economics professions is a horrible and dangerous myth. The government in particular often chooses its highest economist positions, like the chair of the Federal Reserve Board of Governors or members of the President's Council of Economic Advisors, from among the most prominent economists and most prominent economics professors. Similarly, whoever decides to acquire advanced degrees in economics to enter different sectors has already been influenced heavily by academia and the obsession that many of its leaders have with literature-only economic theory. As a corollary, the students who are most conscientious with regard to scientific integrity may decide against pursuing a higher degree of economics if, after seeing the attention given to literature-only economic theory, they come to believe that the field does not sufficiently embrace scientific integrity. As for publications and citation counts, a great deal of my book is devoted to explaining how the publication counts of articles in top-ranked journals and citation counts are not good measures at all of the quality of the literature. In fact, I present a counter-argument that across fields of science, the number of publications per scientist is often inversely related to the extent of useful discovery in that science. This is because the less a scientist or economist discovers anything useful, the more they need to compensate for their lack of any genuine contribution by pumping up their credentials with lists of publications. In other words, publications can serve as a substitute for useful discovery rather than a reflection of useful discovery. But the 500-pound gorilla in the room is, of course, the bad analyses and bad economic policies that will fall out of all the esoteric literature-only economic theory. Let us realize that such literature-only economic theory was driven not by any desire to have the best analyses or to facilitate the best policies, but by the desire to rack up impressive publications for one's CV, perhaps on one's way toward tenure or full professorship. As Stiglitz, Krugman, and others have noted, the academic economics sector was largely responsible for the Great Recession because of its obsession with literature-only economic theory. This was not a small cost with regard to the harm that has been done by this situation. In fact, when we take these ideas as far as we can, we should realize that ultimately millions of lives are at stake because of this problem. As if this is not bad enough, let us also realize that this situation causes a general disbelief among the public that economic theory is based on mathematical impressiveness only. So as a result, politicians and lobbyists look upon economic theory as merely a language for advocacy, rather than a source of knowledge and guidance as to what should be done in terms of the best policies. Ultimately, then, the lack of scientific integrity in academic economic discourse causes the cart to move in front of the horse. That is, politicians first select the policies they want, or the sound bites that they think that will get them elected, and from there find the people to create the economic theory to support those sound bites. And so, literature-only economic theorists become hired guns, not scientists, because nobody, not even those literature-only economic theorists themselves, believe in economics as an objective science. This, by the way, was illustrated quite vividly in the documentary Inside Job, which I highly recommend. Those economics professors who have focused on literature-only economic theory have come to believe that economics is simply nothing more than an intellectual game of amusement, which also happens to provide them with a convenient source of income. The fact that this situation is dangerous and irresponsible, aside from it being unethical, should be now obvious. Admittedly, some parts of my presentation have been repetitive, but this has been by design. I knew going into this that whatever I might say against literature-only economic theory, I will be accused of criticizing economic theory itself. To me, it is analogous to the situation I show in this slide, in which one person is running for his life to get away from a tsunami, and the other is dismissing his concern by saying that he should understand that water is good. I am not saying economic theory is no good. I made that very clear on 3 separate occasions in the previous slides. Number 1, when I gave the criteria for literature-only research, with one of them being that it would never enter into the standard material in a textbook or lecture, while economic theory certainly does enter into textbooks and lectures. Number 2, in the pyramid that I showed, I clearly had one section being useful economic theory as a distinct section from literature-only economic theory. And 3, I put it in writing, in red no less, and read aloud, this is not, I repeat, not a criticism of economic theory itself. I thought these 3 times would have been enough. but let me tell you a little story. When I gave this presentation once before at a conference, there was a discussant who came to the podium to respond to my presentation. And guess what he said? He said to me in the audience something that he probably tells his students 10 times a year. And so for him, it was simply pressing the replay button in his mind. He said that I have it all wrong because, you see, I need to understand that economic theory is not perfect. It is not meant to represent reality, but a part of reality that helps us understand certain economic phenomena. That it is not a complete picture, it is an abstraction. Yes, I get all that. I've known that for 38 years. I've lectured on that very point myself in countless economics classes that I have taught myself for many years. My belief in that is also demonstrated by my own work in publications and what I get paid to do in my day job as an economist, etc. Yes, I get that. And I also get that water is a good thing, that our lives depend on water. But I still run away from tsunamis. And literature-only economic theory is indeed a tsunami that drowns the academic economics profession and largely prevents it from developing the alternative, which is valuable economic theory. Therefore, hopefully, my saying it now for a fourth time will be enough, since 3 times had not been enough when I gave this presentation once before. But after all this, there is hope in my view. As the second title of my book states, we are at a crossroads. Indications are that things have actually been getting a little better lately. What I mean by this is that the proportion of articles in top-ranked journals that might be classified as literature-only economic theory appears to be in decline. However, we are not there yet. The profession is still very confused over whether literature-only economic theory is indeed not good for the profession. We can see this everywhere, even in the publications that are not so dependent on literature-only economic theory. There is still often an implicit admiration for literature-only economic theory. And I believe that most dissertations in economics are still based on the production of literature-only economic theory. So we must keep fighting it off until the profession has the good sense that it is wrong. So, in conclusion, the academic economics profession really needs to clean up its act. And when it finally does, then the Robert Solos and Joe Stiglitzes of the world will not need to testify again before Congress, saying, "Oops, sorry, we were asleep at the wheel again, just too much in love with our beautiful models to pay any attention to what is really happening in the world."